welcome today. We are here to talk about a subject near and dear to many hearts, which is the pursuit of grant money. And we'll be talking about lessons learned in the winning of NIH grants. For the benefit of anybody who's in the audience who doesn't know, we'll be talking about what they call R01 grants and R21s, mostly. So if you're a postdoc and you don't quite know what those are, an R01 grant is the grant that most professors covet because it's the one that gives the most money to finance a lab. So on the low end, an R01 is worth, say, $1,200,000, and on the high end, it's $2,500,000, and sometimes quite a bit more. So that's the range for those, and the R21 is sort of a mini R01. It's a 2-year grant. If you add in the total cost to reflect the university's overhead, you're talking up to maybe about $400,000. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So before we begin and I introduce today's panels, I want to take a moment to advertise something. On Monday, there's going to be an email coming out about a grant course for NIH grants, and there'll be another email out about a grant course for NSF grants. So these are courses conducted mostly by webinar. And this will, the NIH course is one that I'm going to teach. It's going to start February the 25th. As I said, mostly by webinar. And the deadline for signing up is February the 24th. This is not a course on the basics of NIH grants, it's on the advanced stuff. And it's not going to be taught by me telling you what to write, it's going to be taught by me showing you examples of other people's grants. I've got examples from 50 different grants that I can show you, where professors are grappling with all sorts of problems, from the abstract to specific aims, to the introduction, to significance, innovation, approach, the whole shebang. And I'll show you how other people have done this. So it's a course where I'm teaching by showing you examples of other people's work. If you want to take it, the email will be coming out next week. Sign up because there are only 15 slots for it. So that's my ad for today. So let me introduce now our panelists. Get my papers in order. Hold on here. Okay. These are people I have met in the last year or two since I've been here, and I think very highly of them all, and I asked them to be here because they are the sort of people that you would want advice from. That is, they have won grants and they've applied sometimes and lost, so they know the crushing feeling of having the summary statement come back from the reviewers and they didn't like what you proposed. So that's the sort of person you would like to have give you advice. Real people who've submitted real grants and not always made it. But everyone on this table has won an R01 grant. So let me give you an introduction. We have at the far end Jae-Wook Jeong, who recently renewed his R01 grant. By the way, I'm deliberately not telling you what sort of research they do. They all do wonderful things. Please go on the web and look them up. But I want to focus today on grants, not their research. So Jae-Wook, as I said, has just won his renewal of his R01 grant. And next to him we have Rob Abramovich, who, let me back up. Jae-Wook is an associate professor from the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Biology. Next to him we have Rob Abramovich, who's an assistant professor from the Department of Microbiology and Molecular Genetics. And he has won R21 grants and his first R01, I believe. Okay. Next to him is Eric Shapiro, who's now an associate professor from the Department of Radiology and recently won his first R01, is that right? And has won R21 grants and also, I believe they call it a new Innovator Award. Okay. And next to him is Nigel Pamela, who's a professor of epidemiology and biostatistics and pediatrics here, who has won R01 funding and who also teaches a grant writing class each year And it's not just for epidemiologists and biostatisticians. He has people from other colleges throughout the university, and if you're interested in his course, I recommend it, and it will be in May, Nigel? Sometime this summer.
This is EPI 935, if you want to look it up, 935, and it's open to anyone, and it's, you have to be writing a grant. I don't accept anyone who's not got an active plan to submit. It's not an exercise, so we work on your grant 3 weeks intensively between mid-May to early June, and the details will be soon forthcoming.
Okay,
and it's pretty much a full-time operation in those 3 weeks, and we just, the only product is the grant itself at the end of the 3 weeks.
And next to Nigel is Brian Koppel, who is an associate professor of pharmacology and toxicology, and who recently won renewal of his R01. And finally, we have Sue Ewart, who is a professor of large animal clinical sciences and has won R01 funding. And in Sue's case, her writing ability is so highly regarded in her department that people will come to her and say, Sue, would you help us put a shine to our grant? Would you put the music to it? So these are the people who will be speaking to you today, and I'm grateful to have them here. And now let me tell you about this list of questions that you have. The Tom Holland's 20 questions. I sat down and I wrote out a list of questions that I thought I would want to ask if I were an assistant professor. But the questions that really matter here today are not my questions, but yours. So these questions are backup questions. These are the ones I'm going to ask if you don't ask your questions. So we have Jeff Croft here in the audience, who's got a microphone. And Jeff will be looking for you to raise your hand, and if you do, he will come to you with a mic, and you'll have the chance to ask your question of our panel. So, these are the only questions I intend to ask, and if your question isn't asked, it's because you didn't ask it. And so to drum up a little participation here, I'm going to offer a little story, and I'm not going to give you the ending. Instead, I was speaking to Nigel yesterday, and he was telling me that he had an experience of being offered a grant, and he turned it down. Not exactly. Is that not right? Well, then,
I'll have to elaborate.
Okay, he will have to elaborate, but he won't elaborate unless you ask him, because I'm not going to ask him. How was it that he did this? And his answer is a really good one. It goes to the heart of why you are a scientist. Now that's right, isn't it?
The principle is there. What I said was,
don't
say anything yet.
Okay, here we go. First question. How often did you submit grant applications, not just to NIH, but everywhere, when you were first starting out as an assistant professor? Which of you would like to start?
So hi, again, I'm Nigel Pamela from radiology. Starting out as an assistant professor, it's a great time for submitting grants, particularly for two reasons. One is there's a ton of foundations. I know that we're talking about R1s and R2s, but there are a ton of foundations that have these early career grants that you only compete with people who are in their first 3 years of an assistant professorship. So they're like the Packer Foundation. There's a number of them that really restrict the grants to first 3 years, and so you need to really take advantage of that at least once or twice a year. Okay? In terms of setting out my first NIH grant, I didn't send out my first NIH grant until maybe a year after I got my feet out, my feet under me, and that was because you spend so much time trying to hire that first person that to do two things at once I think is a little bit difficult. To devote so much time to the grant and setting up your lab, I think it's actually important to set up your lab first. So we didn't submit up my first NIH grant until after a year. And I'm even, I have a young assistant professor who I'm mentoring now, and after about a year about getting his feet under him, we're getting his first NIH grant out as well. Much more important, I think, is setting out some of these foundation grants where you compete with only people in their first 3 years of their junior faculty position.
Yeah, I would add that
in addition to those kinds of grants, there are a surprising number of small foundations from which you can get $5, $10, $15, $20,000, and often with little effort. And that is a wonderful little pocket to do some preliminary work sometimes. Once a graduate student, I wrote a letter to the Leukemia Foundation of Michigan and got a $10,000 check. You know? I mean, it was really a letter. You know, so they exist. And they all have to spend that lovely rule, 5% of their assets every year. So they're looking to fund people. So if you do a really diligent search of the websites and of the grant, you'll find a lot of possible potential small sources of small funds, which are not bad for you to get some preliminary data so that you can go for some bigger money later.
So I would suggest that there's a related question here, and is that do I submit the exact same proposal to all these different places? And ideally, you would submit something that's enough different to different places that you don't have overlap. And I would suggest that one of the things that I've learned is, in many cases, less is more. And we've been criticized or critiqued for maybe trying to do too much within one grant. And so the ability for you to carve out one piece of information, you're not going to solve all the world's problems with any single experiment or grant, but what's one piece that you can package and submit for funding, and to another place package a related but a different piece of science that you'd like to fund. So it's not always possible, and sometimes you will submit, you may want to submit the same thing to a couple places, and a problem of success would be to have two different funding awards on the same topic, and of course you would only be able to accept one of those. So that would be a nice problem to have, but being able to tailor it to slightly different so that you don't have overlap.
So I can give you my experience. So I guess similar to what's been said, it was really almost 2 years before I submitted my first R01. And the reason for that is, and this was contrary to what my chair at the time was telling me to do, I was at a different institution, so it shouldn't be, be a problem. But we were constantly being told that we should be submitting grants continuously. But I thought at the time what was best for me is to put in one strong grant that had all the nice preliminary data that I needed. And so it was about 2 years, and it did really well. And I think the reviewers appreciated that. Another thing that I think helped me is that I had independent publications from my postdoctoral mentor by then, which also looks good. It doesn't have to be a Science or Nature paper, but as long as you can show that you can run a lab and produce and publish that research, I think it really helps also in getting your grant funded.
Yeah, I could say from my experience, when I came in, I sort of followed the similar sorts of paths. I applied for smaller grants, a lot of them, and foundation grants. And actually waited until my third year to put in the R01. I wanted to have independent papers. I wanted to have a track record of funding, and I wanted to have, enough preliminary data that, when the panel looked at it, they'd be like, yeah, this is something that's interesting. And the lab is established independently. So I waited quite a while for that before putting in the R01. And just kept the lab running on smaller grants until then. Yep.
Okay, I have same experience. I tried to get several small grants. I got a 2 pilot grant issued my good record for public the grant application, and also it's helped to generate preliminary data. After I get that small pilot seed money, I try to generate strong preliminary data and just focus on R01 grant, and then finally I got the R01.
A question out in the audience?
Let me just say one thing about something that I did that worked out pretty well. And this was a total lottery, right? So as Tom mentioned, I got one of these NIH Director New Innovator Awards, right, which is R1 level funding, but it's a separate grant mechanism, and you can only apply for this if you've never gotten an R1, okay? So we had a decision to make at about, the second or third year into where I was, where Dr. Abramovich submitted an R1. We had this crazy idea. Good crazy, but crazy idea. And it was kind of inappropriate for an R01 because it bordered on the crazy, and we didn't have enough preliminary data to really support an R01, but the idea was just, could be fairly revolutionary. And so I decided to submit one of these new Innovator Awards, which the grant mechanism still exists today. I got mine in 2008. The grant mechanism still exists today, and if, for an assistant professor or even, a junior professor, even a junior associate professor who's not gotten an R01, you qualify still to submit a new Innovator Award. This is the DP2 award. And the success rates for those are harder than R1s. I think they're 4 or 5%. Okay, but it's an interesting opportunity available to you without an opportunity that you should seriously consider if you've got an idea that, again, borders on the crazy, potentially high impact, and you sit in that nice pocket of, I've been a couple years, I've got a couple papers, I've got some data. I really recommend trying for this grant mechanism.
I'd like to amplify something Eric just said. He had a crazy idea, and I think the most exciting thing about science is crazy ideas. And I was in the lucky position when I first set out. I actually sent in a submission in the middle of the first year of my first academic appointment, which is a clinical appointment. It wasn't actually a real academic appointment. I'm a clinician. I'm trained as a pediatrician. It was after my training in epidemiology. I submitted a grant. It had actually been hatched while I was still a student. And I really should have had no prospects of getting funded. It was an R01, but I did because they liked the idea. And I think you have to keep that in mind. If the idea is a good one, sometimes the most strangest things happen. And it reminds us that, we talk about strategies and we talk about, but the fundamental thing is, the most important thing is this a good scientific idea? Keep that in mind.
How many people read your grants before you submit, and who do you ask to read the grants for you?
So my last grant, I think I had 3 different people read the grant. You want to find individuals that are truly going to read it and give you critical feedback. I think we talked about this before, but if you give somebody your grant and they give it back to you and say, hey, this sounds great, it's really good, they really didn't review it well. So you want very sharp criticism back on your grant, because that's what's going to be helpful. So you need to find the people that are going to do that and take the time. And that's hard because, everybody's very busy right now. But it's important to have other people look at your grant.
I know from my experience, in my department we have a structured mentoring program for assistant professors. So I have 2 experienced professors who've in the department who've basically agreed to read anything I write. And so I kind of abused that privilege. And so I had them read through the R01s very carefully. And then I also was able to take advantage of, they had these professional grant editing service for assistant professors here at MSU. So I got into that very early. And so I had a professional editor read through it. And then collaborators. So when you're writing a grant, you bring in, co-investigators, and they all got some skin in the game, and so they also can read through it carefully. So I'd say for my last grant, there's probably, I guess 6 people read it very carefully, and they all had different opinions, conflicting opinions, and that's the hardest part, right? So one person wanted a lot more detail on the specific aims page, and the other person was like, you just got to cut it all out and put more white space in. And how do you deal with that? How do you decide? But so I think that was the hardest part, was all the conflicting ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, so I also took advantage of the grant writing service, with Tom, and it was kind of interesting too, because I think that the thing that Tom showed me on one grant, and this is the grant we got the R1, we got a 5% on it, so he must have done something good. Tom helped clear a ton of space in this grant. We were all the way to the 12th page. We were basically on the 13th page, and Tom and I'm sure other grant writer.
Jeff Tatro.
Huh?
Jeff Tatro was a fellow you worked with.
I had Jeff too.
Yeah, but I think that you also took a look at it
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. And both of you actually did different things. I think you in particular were very helpful in cutting out these superfluous words that I had strewn throughout the grant. We have previously shown that, this is, this thing, right? And so what was really interesting is, so in that grant you were very helpful, and the other editors were very helpful. We just, again, submitted a new R01, and I didn't go to the grant writing, to the grant editing service, but what I learned from that, I then applied to this grant, and I even went back and cleared my own space after I had just written, and it was very useful. So I actually found multiple individuals within the VP's office, this grant editing service, to be extremely helpful, both in the grant itself, but also in teaching me how to write my next grant. So, as far as other people looking at my grant, I don't do that. I don't do that. Mainly because I don't finish in time to allow someone to have a good crack at it. I think that would be really useful. I just don't.
I work in a fairly multidisciplinary, large collaboration, and in my group there are 5 to 7 people who are actively involved in crafting most of the grants that we submit. And so we will have all of them using track changes. We're in 3 different institutions, and so we have documents flying around with track changes in it, and the senior person, or the PI on the grant, is the one that decides what to keep, because there are often opposing opinions. But if I may tell a related story in relationship to working with this larger collaboration, there was a grant that I was working on. My field of study is expertise, and I was working with an epidemiologist. I love epidemiologists, but there was a part of the grant written by the epidemiologist, and I didn't really understand it that well. And I thought, but that's fine, because I'm not an epidemiologist. So we submitted the grant, and it came back, and apparently others didn't understand it either. And what I learned from that, and we actually jokingly called it the Sioux test. If it passes the Sioux test, if I can understand it, then any reviewer could understand it. And so we had to, whether it was the genetics, the pediatrics, the epidemiology, everybody in the group had to understand it. And when we submitted that grant a second time, and it scored at the 0.2 percentile. And the reviewers were so appreciative of the changes that we had made. So being able to listen to all your colleagues or collaborators, but make sure that there is a unifying level of information that everybody can understand.
Yeah, there's another principle there. The bottom line is, if you're the PI, everything you write is yours, every single word. And if you don't understand it, there's a problem. Even if you have a complex statistical algorithm in there or a detailed biochemical mechanism, you at least have to have enough understanding of it so that you could say what it's all about to somebody, not maybe in every detail. So you have to own the grant. And I've seen reviews come back, including here, where someone says, great statistical section seems unrelated to the overall grant. So the statistician did their job, but the PI didn't integrate that specialty into the overall aims of the grant. And that's a common difficulty in multi-disciplinary teams. So as PIs, you should watch out for that.
Yeah, in my case, first I asked to review my previous mentor was senior people to make sure my significance and innovation, that part is correct. And then I asked to read my training, including the postdoc and student. They should understand what I want to do, especially approach part. Maybe they know better than me. And then I also asked some of the not scientific people like a secretary, and they will remove all of grammatic error or whatever thing. And the final step, the good thing is NMS is we have the editor service, and ask Tom to make more clean and straightforward. That's what I do.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that. I think several of us are on study section, and I don't have time if I'm reviewing 9, 10 grants to go learn about your field. So if I start reading your grant and I have no idea what you're talking about and it's completely unclear, it's not going to benefit your score. I can tell you that. So it has to be very simple and understandable in order to get it funded.
Yeah, study sections are huge and diverse, and they don't always get the most perfect person to review your grant. You better be sure that everything is clear, not to the most expert person, but to someone who has only a nodding acquaintance with the field. It really almost has to be readable by the understandable by the educated layman. And if you don't, if you're afraid of talking, don't be afraid of talking down to study section. Everybody knows that. That's why I always write MS, the abbreviation. Everybody knows that's multiple sclerosis, except the other guy thinks it's mitral stenosis. You just have to be. You can't overestimate how much you're into your own head when you write a grant, and you have to step outside it and recognize that it's somebody else. You're not reviewing it. Your twin brother's not reviewing it. It's someone quite different. And try to write it in such a way that it's very crystal clear to anyone who's not really expert in the field.
Question out in the audience? Okay, well then I will, I'll take one from my list. So I have no plan for this, I'm just going at random. So some people submit grants they know will lose. They'll say, I know this isn't good enough to win, but I'll send it in and see what the reviewers say. So my question to you guys, is this a good idea, or should they hold off submitting until they know they have a real chance to win? Who wants to start with that?
I can start with that one. I'll start with this one because I'm reviewing grants for a study section that meets in 2 weeks. My idea is that the first score that you get on your grant is likely to be a base for subsequent scores. So, and know that if you resubmit a grant, that the reviewers have the prior critique. They don't have your prior grant, but they have your prior critique, and that includes the scores. So know that the scores range from 1 to 10. So if you submitted something that just wasn't ready for showtime, you're going to get a poor score. So maybe you got a 7. That's pretty bad. And then you made some substantial improvements, and your score went up 2, 3 points to 5 or 4. And that's still not good enough to be funded. So don't give the reviewer, my opinion to the answer is to use your colleagues, not the reviewers, for friendly fire, because you don't want to show the idea before it's ready. Now, related, you can talk to program officers about your ideas, about the study section's interest in it. They can be very good people to bounce ideas off, but know that your past information will stay with you in a resubmission.
So I don't know that I've ever submitted a grant that I knew I wasn't going to get. It sounds very pretentious, but I never submitted, junk. But I have submitted grants that I knew were flawed. There was a flaw in in what I had proposed, or if the reviewers really knew this, they would know that what I'm proposing to do is actually much more difficult than how I've made it out. And so my mentality and the way I thought about this is that I actually know much more about what I'm proposing, what I'm thinking about, than my reviewer will know. And it's not dishonest to send in a grant that is flawed in some sense. It just means that I don't have the answer right this second. But I'm confident in some sense that in the 2 years of research leading up to AIM 3, which is where this potential flaw might lie, then I'll have figured it out by then. And so, again, in grants where I've known that there's a flaw, I've still submitted those. And in fact, I've gotten grants that the approach might have a bit of a flaw in it. Our data analysis is probably the wrong way of looking at this, but my reviewers aren't going to really know that in some sense. And those have done well. So, again, if you're questioning your own grant in terms of, this is flawed or this is never going to fly, think of whether or not it's a fatal flaw. You don't want to be dishonest, or you don't want to say you're going to do something that's you're not going to do, or say something that's simply not true. But you don't have to invent time travel all the time in a grant. Some things can be left to be done.
I might differ a little bit from Eric on this one. I always like to feel when I'm submitting a grant. I actually say this to myself: do I have the feeling, which I have had most often when I submit a grant, and how could they possibly turn this down? I like to get into that sense, that feeling. And but I will agree a little bit with Eric in that sometimes, I'm an epidemiologist, so a lot of my stuff is people out in populations, and there are contingencies that you can't anticipate. And study section loves to do that to epidemiologists. How will you ever recruit that many people? Oh, they don't want to do this, they'll never agree, or whatever, all the practical matters. And sometimes you have to be ambitious because you can't prove to anyone that you can do something in the field. It has to be done in the field. You may have even done it before, but this is a different population and so forth. So there is a stretch sometimes in those areas, and you have to be able to convince that you could actually do it. But I really do feel that I've often, more than once, I have said, I'm not feeling that yet. Let me wait one more cycle. I'd rather feel that strong. And I've had a very high fraction funded, so I think that's part of it. I think it's much better to feel very comfortable yourself that you've done everything you should do, and then put it in. Now you can't aim for perfection. If you're a perfectionist, you'll never submit a grant if you're that kind of person. But so you have to have some compromises, like Eric says. But at least you should feel it's a very good shot.
I also want to mention about time. I think we have 3 cycles for NIH grant application. And I think it takes more than 3 months to get review comment. And if our grant application is triaged, we don't get much information. Right. So make sure, if you have any problem, I recommend to solve that before your application.
So I'll reiterate what Sue said. So I'm reviewing grants for 2 weeks also for study section, and all reviewers might do it this way, but typically what I'll start with is the specific aims page, and I'll read through that. But then if it's already been reviewed previously, then I'll read the previous review and see what did the previous reviewers say, what were their scores. And if the scores are 8s, 7s, and 6s in the previous review, I go into that grant knowing that in the back of my mind that this must have been pretty bad the first time. So, and the other issue is, and this was not the case when I started out, but now you have only 1 page for a rebuttal to the previous review. And if you have 30, 40 issues that they came up with, you can't possibly address all those in 1 page. It used to be 3 pages, which was nice, but now it's 1 page. So if you can't address everything that they say In the next review, the reviewer is going to say is they were non-responsive to the previous review. They didn't answer all the queries that the previous reviewers had. So it's best to go in when you know it's ready.
I could also maybe just add also, one way I also kind of look at it is, at least in my field, it's a very small community, and for what I study tuberculosis, on the study panel, there's going to be 3 tuberculosis researchers. And basically, I'm going to know them all, and they're going to know me. And as a scientist, when you're young, you know what you have is your reputation is important as a scientist. And I'd feel really bad to give them something that's junky, and then run into them at meetings or something later, and having wasted their time. So there's a bit of that going on too. That these are your colleagues who are reading your grants. You don't want to waste their time at some level.
I have such a funny story to say about this one-page rebuttal that it's perfect for right now, right? So, for those of you who know me, my thing is medical imaging, MRI mostly, but medical imaging in general. And we submitted a grant, mostly about some biomaterials for medical imaging, right? And so, in the summary statement, there was all kinds of criticisms about the approach or this or that, and someone had made the comment that this team of investigators could really benefit from having someone who's an expert in medical imaging, right? So of course, I took a lot of offense at that, right? Because not for nothing, right? But they had interpreted me as a biomaterials person, which I'm a pretend biomaterials person, right? So they said they wanted someone with medical imaging expertise, and so I went to a mentor of mine. This was a couple years ago, and I said, I've got only one page, and there were some things I had to really discuss in that one page. I don't really have room to talk about the fact that I am indeed an expert in medical imaging. He goes, you know what? That didn't even come up in the summary statement, because when you get the summary statement and you've gotten scored, you get the discussion of your grant, and they didn't bring it up in the discussion. It didn't seem to be an important thing, so don't even bother. They'll correct him in the study section. Oh, we know this guy; he's a medical imaging expert. Don't worry about it. Anyway, so I don't address that comment at all because I don't have space. Had I had a couple pages, or had I done a better job in the grant, I wouldn't have to. Anyway, so we resubmit it. It comes back that I was unresponsive to the previous concerns because I didn't add an expert in medical imaging, and because I didn't have enough space to say, by the way, I'm a medical, just a one line. I didn't even have one line to say that, and my mentors just told me not to even put it in.
Yeah, the advice. Did you say came from a program officer?
No, this was one of the reviewers. Oh,
no, but the advice not to include that because it's not in the summary.
Was not a program. Was a mentor of mine at my institution. Yeah.
I've had the rule for many years: never ignore any negative comment. If you have to write it, just a word. The guy who made it, who got ignored, is pissed. Didn't they see that I pointed this out to them? And you don't want an angry person on the study section because they can move a study section. We've seen that, right? One person. So my rules, everything they have said, if you can possibly extract and make even the smallest response to it so nobody is left. I also like to begin my responses with, everybody does this, I suppose. We appreciate the insightful, brilliant, thoughtful comments on our grant. And then I say that they noticed. And I mentioned the assets. I always mention the assets. And they noticed that we have a really great interdisciplinary team, and they noticed that this is innovative, But they had some problems, but we fix those completely in this application in the following ways. So I would really, I think that's an interesting experience because it really does verify the rule that it's a big risk to take if you leave out someone's, no matter where. If it's the fourth reviewer in the last line, I'd attend to it.
I have a related story or comment to Eric's. Because we have a fairly large collaborative group, we tell the story of our group and who we are. We don't take a lot of space, and obviously we can't do it on necessarily one page, but we give a framework. This project is led by Dr. So-and-so with expertise in this, and they reached out to our epidemiologist, who is that, and we've added a biostatistician for this. And basically, every person who is a key personnel gets their name in a line and how and why they're a part of the team.
Right.
And we also do it sort of over time, and we've published these many co-authored, peer-reviewed manuscripts, and we tell that team story. And you can do that a couple places. We do it in the text of the grant, even though the length is diminished over time. We still find a couple of lines for that. And then we do it in the bio sketches as well, who we are and how we each contribute. So that's, I think, been quite a useful tool that we use.
I'll second that. When I teach, I say you have to have a place where you describe the team and why it's a team and not 17 individuals with different skills. It has to be a team, and bio sketches are very powerful nowadays with that paragraph that they require you to do about why it's relevant, and the PI must look at every single one of those and make sure they're coherent with each other. I can't tell you how many grants I've seen with the biosketch paragraph, frankly, not even belonging to that grant, especially the high institutions, the one with prestige, where they think they don't have to work very hard, and you get this paragraph that belongs to the last grant the person put in. Or the biosketch is like, you can see it's about 12 months old. They haven't any publications from this year because somebody, I need your biosketch, and it got put in the last moment. These are details to carefully attend to because they suggest you're not a team. That's why you're going to get downgraded. And you have to, if you have a team, you have to show that you are a team, not just a bunch of individuals.
So, and I want to bring up one point that was mentioned earlier, and that's about how, you had said that everybody on the study section basically knows you. So that's another very important thing. So I knew David Morrison, who goes around and puts on grant writing workshops, and he's done it for 30 years.
Done it here too.
Yeah, and he does it here. So I've known him for quite a while. And he actually, one of his things is he said, the number one thing that you can do to get your grant funded, he goes, you can write the most perfect grant, but if you submit it, the one thing you can do to really give it a chance to be funded is to have somebody on the study section know you and advocate for you. If nobody on the study section knows you, you're going to have a much tougher time. And that is very true. So it's, I think, very important to get to know the people who are on the study section. You can find that online very easily. A good place to meet these people are at small meetings like Gordon conferences, EB summer conferences, but I mean, get to know them and have them get to know you, hopefully in a good way and not in a bad way, but that's probably one of the best things you can do to really help your grant.
Another question.
So tied to the issue of, whether you submit a grant before it's really kind of fully ready, I wondered to what degree you folks have thought about issues of opportunity cost of, well, what am I working on and what else could I be working on instead?
Well, maybe it's just the opportunity for me to say what I did say to Tom. I said there are three things that can happen. It's like a forward pass in football. Three things can happen. We always think, completion, incompletion, but you can be intercepted. There are three things that can happen with a grant. You can get funded. You can get not get funded. But there's a third thing. This is worse than not getting funded. You can get funded for something you don't really want to do. That is the most adverse outcome you can have. And there is this tendency now, because there's money here and somebody has a special opportunity, there's a pot here, there's a pot there. Let me go for this, I need to be funded. The pressure is less here because we have more firm funding, but in places where you're completely grant dependent, which is a lot of universities, people just have to reach out. And then they're stuck doing something they don't want to do. And I would say that's a fate worse than not getting funded. So I only think, I say to people, don't ever do research unless you really want to do it, for God's sakes. And about what you want to do, not about something that somebody suggests you might want to do. If you don't have it inside, don't bother.
Okay, we touched on this. We talked about grant scores, so here's one. If a grant gets really bad scores from reviewers, does that mean it can't be fixed? Who wants to start with that?
Well, I give you my experience on my renewal. So it did not get scored the first submission, and then I got it funded on the resubmission. But I took a lot of time to do the experiments that they said I needed to do, and put all of that data in there and responded to all the comments, and they were very appreciative, and that got funded. So even though you don't get scored, you can still get that funded on resubmission.
There's an interesting statistic that was from the days when we had 3 submissions. Remember, there was a period of unlimited submissions, 3 submissions, 2 submissions, unlimited submissions again. But in the days of 3 submissions, this was the statistic. 15% of all the funding went to first submissions, 15% went to second submission, 70% went to third submissions. 70% of all grants were funded on the 3rd try. So absolutely, I've been unscored, gone to funded in 2 or 3 cycles. So it's absolutely, and just because you're triaged the first time does not mean you're out of it. Sometimes the triage is based on one particular thing that you haven't made clear, or a misunderstanding or an uncertainty that you can clarify, and bingo, you're off to the races.
Yeah, I could comment on my RO1. It came back with a pretty poor score of a 40, and when I got back to the summary statement, it was just the longest list of criticisms I'd ever seen. It seemed like one of the worst reviewed grants I'd ever gotten. And so I was actually thinking of maybe putting in a new submission. And so I called up the program officer and talked with her about it. And she was at the meeting, and she said they're actually enthusiastic about the project, and that it was just they didn't like the grant, and that if I can make the changes that the reviewers are asking for, so there's 30 plus changes, that it should be resubmitted. So I did resubmit it. I went from a 40 to a much to a fundable score, and so in a way it's. There's 2 different kinds of, I guess, bad scores. There's bad scores where there's things that are readily fixable, and there's bad scores where it's not fixable. And sometimes the program officer can give you some ideas where that's at. And I was when I looked at it at first, I couldn't see through all the criticism to see that they're actually readily addressable issues that they brought up. So you can't always tell what you need to from just a score or a bunch of critiques.
One thing I want to add is that if you get a bad comment for the, I think, significance or innovation part, it's nearly difficult to address it.
Point.
If it's got a lot of the comment for the approach part, maybe you can try again, but if it's not important thing in the field.
Yeah, and I would add that I think, this is why the specific aims page is so important, I think people make up their mind about significance after the first page. This is, the aims page kind of says this is an interesting problem to deal with, and maybe some approach. Now we'll find out how it plays out. But if they don't buy that it's an interesting problem, no matter what approach you have, it's not going to matter, right? So you have to, that specific aims page is so central. I believe that 50% of the score is in the specific aims page. And then, they decide. And then often, by the way, you have to be careful. Sometimes a criticism of approach is really a criticism of significance. And they kind of find they don't like this idea anyway, so let's see if we can't knock out the statistics a bit and knock out the techniques in the lab a bit. And it really, and then another grant with similar flaws, but they really love the idea. Suddenly it's, the statistics are fine, the lab tests are okay. So it kind of, approach sometimes reflects not a feeling, not being grabbed by the idea. So I think that aims page, that's where I spend most of the time chipping away. Get that page so that it really sounds like you're doing something very interesting and worthwhile.
I can build on what Rob said in terms of the value of a conversation with the program officer. And I've had some very valuable, informative conversations with program officers who are in the room. They are for the reviews, and while the comments are written, they can make those three-dimensional, they can flesh that out a little bit, they can be particularly helpful in helping you interpret what it is that the reviewers liked, what they had concerns about, what their overall enthusiasm is, and how to respond. So it is worth cultivating a relationship with the program officer, and it's absolutely worth picking up the phone or making an appointment to speak with the program officer once you get your review sheets back.
I want to mention one of my experience about our cancer study. So we submit one proposal. We generate a nice animal model for the endometrial cancer and submit the grant. But it has like a good score but not fundable. So I address it, but it's not funded. The problem is it need to go to the correct study session. If we have same hypothesis, depend on what study session, sometimes you get a good score, sometimes not. After that, I change the study session and then it's funded.
Good point.
So the reason is the first study session was like tumor biochemistry study session, something like that. They keep asking what is the molecular mechanism in our animal model. It's nearly difficult. And then I turn to the tumor biology study session, and it's related to human cancer. They give the good score.
Interesting. Got to get the right.
Okay,
Gotta get the right study section. That's important.
So I'm a little confused about how to get into the correct study section, because some people have told me that you justify which study section is most appropriate in your cover letter, and then other people have told me that it's all automatic based on the keywords in your abstract. So is it the first one?
No, you can request a study section, and NIH has the view that all study sections are good, and they don't care. If you want to go to the study section for molecular biology with your EPI application, if you think that you want that, good. I've never seen anyone refuse the study section. I'm happy to stand corrected if you request it.
Actually.
You have? Oh, really? Interesting. Okay, so it must happen occasionally. But generally, NIH backs its study sections. It says they're all equivalent. They're all, standardized anyway. There's no easy or hard study section because of the standardization of scores. But the key thing is to really go find the right study section. And you have to do some research on that. You have to look at the list. You have to see who's in it. You have to see what disciplines are represented. If you have a kind of, outlier anthropology grant, and there are no anthropologists on study section, don't bother. I'm afraid that's not going to happen. If you don't really have a biostatistician, but maybe a mathematician or an engineer who does some statistics, or a psychologist, and you go to study section with 3 biostatisticians on it, you're dead in the water. Discipline counts, interest. You should see who's on study section. You should see what the topics are. You should see what this study section has funded previously. You can find that on an NIH report. Does it look like my grant, what they funded previously? And I've been known to do this. Look at the publications of some key people on study section and see what they write, so that when you trash a study, at least it's not a study of someone on study section. It's probably not a clever idea. So know the study section.
I could say that I did exactly what you mentioned there. Is I went on Reporter, and because I could fit into 2 or 3 different study sections, I looked at what my closest colleagues, where they were funded from, and went to that study section. So it's all public. Oh, just in the cover letter.
So I've seen an experience recently where, at least in my field, somebody had suggested a particular study section and it didn't go there.
Do you know why? Was it explained? Because it's rare.
Yeah, I know. And no, it really wasn't explained. And actually, they tried to contact CSR to find out why did this happen, and they wouldn't even reply back as to why it happened, which is highly unusual.
That's not kosher.
So, no, it's not. And so, what you can do, if you really want a particular study section, is in the cover letter, suggest that study section and say, the reason why I believe this is the best is because my grant is focused on this, and each study section has a description of what they will review, and you can actually just pick exact sentences out of what they say and put it in your cover letter. So that it will end up there.
I think that equally important, maybe more important, is an experience that I just had, which was not deciding or requesting a particular study section, but figuring out whether a particular RFA that had a dedicated study section was appropriate for a grant. Right, so you could submit to a parent R01 your same idea, or you can submit to a particular RFA that will have a dedicated study section for that. And so the example is this grant that we just put in a grant to design human ovarian cancer models in pigs. And we could have submitted a straight-up R01 that would be reviewed by NCI. There was a grant mechanism that I had found that was development of animal models for biomedical research. And I hadn't actually read the announcement carefully enough to see that NCI wasn't participating in that. So actually I was going to submit this grant in response to this RFA. I called the program officer. He says, you didn't read the announcement carefully enough. You see NCI doesn't participate. I suggest you go and look for an NCI grant. And he gave me the name of a program officer at NCI who then I went and talked to. And she said there's a brand new program announcement that was designing mammalian models for cancer research, which was perfect. And that there would be a dedicated study section. So I also went to Reporter, and this was a sort of reinvention of a standing study section that was just mouse models of cancer. Now they opened up for mammals. And I talked to her, and I looked, and they'd only ever awarded mouse models before. And I said, you're clearly going to be expecting large animal grants because you've opened it up to all mammals. And she said, yes. I said, so I assume you'll be having reviewers on the panel who will be then receptive to large animals, and said, yes, she's actually working on doing this. And so, this, by way of the RFA, was the perfect study section rather than me submitting it, because, it would have gone to a parent cancer, and, it's sort of roulette at that point. Now, I'm not sure whether this is going to be a good strategy or not, because now there's going to be people who will be, a bit more knowledgeable about what I'm proposing. Sometimes it's nice for your reviewers to be more naive. But anyway, this is the approach that I took, and this is how we settled.
And just to add, RFAs are tricky because, if there are several forms of NIH soliciting applications. The program announcements is the loosest one. They just say, we like studies on this topic, in any study section. The RFA is a little bit more focused, and often the problem is it takes away the idea because the idea is already suggested. So that's a little difficult sometimes. And also, they vary as to whether that goes to an ordinary study section or they set up a special one just to review. Some of the larger RFA pots will have their own specially designed, specially assembled for this purpose study section. You can't know in advance, really, what it's like. So RFA is always, the issues are always a bit more complex and difficult to predict.
I can just add a comment on the study section. There are standing study section members. There are standing members, but then for each of the meetings, they invite additional individuals to participate. And oftentimes those additional individuals are invited based on the needs for the grants that came in that cycle. And so the other thing that you can do in a cover letter is discuss why it's appropriate for that particular study section. But again, I go back to my particular case where it's a broad collaboration across disciplines, and sometimes that's hard to fit within a single study section. And so we'll go for the most appropriate one, but we'll also need some expertise that's maybe a little bit outside that study section, and you can highlight that in the cover letter, that people with expertise in, A, B, and C, or A, B, or C, would be valuable to read the grant. And so when they are considering who they need to invite, we're telling them, please invite someone who has particular expertise in this field.
Yeah, you can suggest that, and I've suggested it once. I had the horrible experience of suggesting that they need an expert in the field. They had no one on this field, and they brought an expert in the field the expert in the field, raised a difficulty on the third review that had not been noticed in the first two reviews. We got the grant eventually, but there was a little bit of sweating going on.
That's what I mean, that sometimes it's nice for your reviewers to be a bit naive.
Yeah, it's true.
How much of each aim was done before you, or when you submitted the grant?
Do you mean, I guess you mean done of what you had proposed in the grant?
Sometimes I hear it's, you're already at aim 1, 3, 1, done. So that way you can get out with 2 and 3. You will come us.
Could you ask that question? Jeff, give him the mic. Ask it again so we get it on the recording.
Oh, which,
This is being recorded for people who can't make the meeting.
Yeah.
So would you just ask your question again, please?
what I just said or what I said?
Yeah, what you just said. Just ask it again so it'll be recorded.
Well, some people have most of aim 1 done, so they can focus on 2 and 3 when it's funded, and then when time comes for renewal, they're ready to go.
So I've also heard of grants that are mostly done before they're submitted. You know, I mean, I've heard of these things. I don't think you're supposed to submit a grant when you've already done the work. I think that's unethical. That being said, I've also heard these things. They tend to do pretty well. I have never done that for the official recording. That being said, right, your preliminary data is in an R1 should be strong. Right, so if aim 1 is to figure out this one thing and you've got half of it sort of done, you need to increase the numbers to achieve statistical significance, you need to prove the mechanism using, different blocking agents for a transporter. Those are things that I think are rational, reasonable, ethical approaches. But I've also heard these urban legends of aims being fully done and, papers come out before the grant's even reviewed,
Yeah, I agree with Eric. I've heard it, but I've never done it. It's kind of like if you've really done a lot of aim 1, why not put that into your preliminary data to suggest strength? Really, I think you're kind of wasting the power of your preliminary data sometimes, and I think that might be held against you as well. And plus, if of course, they can read your preliminary data and kind of figure out that you've done aim 1 already, that's not going to look very good. So if they can smell that out. So I don't think that's too good a strategy right now.
One issue that can come up, though, and this has happened to me, and I know another colleague, is where, the time in between submitting a grant and it being reviewed is a large space of time. And in that time, you're not going to stop doing the research. And so I've had an instance where, I keep working on it, but I submitted the revision, and I had an issue where I really wanted to publish this work, but I didn't want to have to completely change the grant then and add a new aim and take out an aim. So I mean, it's difficult because your research is going to keep moving, and the time to submission to getting the revision in and is you're talking over a year. So there is times where you can have a lot of it done before it's funded. I can see that happening because you're not going to stop working on the grant or the research. The problem comes in is if you really want to publish that data and your grant is sitting at NIH waiting to be reviewed, and so.
Well, given the fact that you want to pick a study section where there's shared expertise that is really competent to review your study aims, and the fact that sometimes it's a small community out there, so you get the roster maybe a month ahead of time, and you can see there are perhaps competing researchers who know you, but it could be a two-edged sword. It could cut either way. Under what circumstances would you consider asking a study section officer to perhaps recuse particular possible reviewers?
technically, you actually don't have to submit a reason. You can just say, I think so-and-so is in conflict. In practice, though, you have to be careful because it's really a little bit difficult to know who will say what when, who will think what when. And it is a known difficulty, in the scientific community that. I mean, I've heard of instances of this. Famous researcher A is the expert on some organism, and now you're coming up, the upstart, and you're also interested in that organism, and that reviewer is not interested in anybody else getting funded. There are legends about this, and I think some are based in truth. So a lot of that, on the other hand, I know very good instances of senior people who are in a field, and when they see a young person coming into that same field, they say, that's fabulous. That's great. Let's encourage this proposal. We need more people doing the kind of work I'm doing. So it's a matter of personality rather than field. Now, so I think I'd be cautious about having someone recuse. I once received a request from I was just told, so-and-so wants you recused. And I have no idea why. I'd never had any conflict with this person. It was not even in the same field. I think some urban legend had built up that in our previous review I didn't like it, but I actually didn't even review it. But, people hear things and they make conclusions. I said, well, all right, one less grant to review. So, because they don't have to tell you why. And I said, well, why was this person, I don't see why. They don't have to tell you. So, conflicts are strictly enforced in study section. You know what the key ones are. They can't be in the same institution, can't have a financial relationship, can't have co-authored in the last 3 years, can't have been on the doctoral committee. After that, it gets pretty hazy and judgmental.
I was given some good advice by this program officer that I just talked about who turned me on to this grant. Again, this was previously a mouse-only grant, and then they just changed it to mammals. And I said I wanted to do this ovarian cancer model on pigs, and she said, let me give you some caution. That again, a lot of the study section will be held over for this new one that they'll be adding. She said, I'll give you some advice. Don't trash the mouse model of cancer in your grant. And I said, that's a really good point, because the first line of my grant is mouse models are deficient for da-da-da-da-da. No, of course we talked about some of the challenges of mouse models, but I changed the language and I was actually much more complimentary in the instance that, and it's not exactly a conflict, but, it could be that, in general, if you know that someone's on your study section who's, studied system A, right, and you're developing system B, the last thing you want to do is system A is really bad,
We can go further. We can improve.
Yeah.
Go beyond.
Building on the advances that system A, right? There's good language.
That's right.
If you do have experience or a history of scientific conflict, then I think it's reasonable to state that. Ask for an individual to be recused. We have some situations that are particular. Maybe two people out there in the world who we know what they're going to say about the work, and it's not what we want in a study section. So, but it isn't always who you predict, like in Nigel's case. So, for us, we would only do it if that history is well established, that they're truly act in conflict.
Got a question? Okay, then I've got one. As we've been sitting here, all of you at one time or another have touched upon the importance of a program officer and getting to know your officer and getting advice out of them. For the benefit of the audience, I have spoken to people over the years, and some people speak to program officers and they don't get the time of day hardly. And others are so glad that they called because they got such tremendous advice. Do you have any advice about getting the most out of your program officer and getting them to respond in the first place?
Well, I just had a good experience with mine. I straight up called them, out of the blue. They couldn't talk right then. They were actually at a conference, and she said she'd call me back, and she called me back, and we spoke for over an hour on the phone. right? So that was a really good experience with this program officer, a person I'd never met before. I've had experiences that I had wished would be better with program officers. So program officers are supposed to be in the room during the review, and they sit and listen, and you can, like you say, I like this, give some three-dimensionality to it. That's beautifully put. And I had hoped that this one program officer would have been able to do that, and in that instance, they were not very helpful, and it was a little bit disappointing because there was something said in the summary statement that seemed like they were reviewing another grant in some sense. And I wanted to, and this person was unable to provide extra context for that. So I've had good, I've had disappointing. You know, it's like anybody else in any business in some sense. Some are helpful, some are not. But I've had a very good interaction with program officer.
So I help my program officer as much as possible. And in fact, I haven't really used that phrase before, but I think about that in terms of the grant as well. I try to make life as easy as possible for the reviewer, and I also make life as easy as possible for the program officer. And so typically I'm going to have a one-page document prepared for the program officer before I talk to him or her. Presumably it's a specific aims page or the at least modestly polished draft of the specific aims page, or whatever it is that I want to talk about. And then I'll set up, I'll send an email requesting a phone conversation, an appointment. And if I don't get a response from that, then I'll send an email that tells them when I'm going to call. But I always attach that one-page document to give them a little bit of background on what I want to talk about, what I want to get out of it. And some program officers, just like some people, are fabulous and helpful, and some program officers are less helpful.
Yep, I think you really need to know what a program officer can and can't do, though, right? So a program officer can't do anything about the review, right? So one should see the program officer as sort of your connection to the study section, but they don't say anything during study section. They don't influence. They don't, say, oh, no, reviewer 3, you've got it wrong. I've talked to, they don't do anything like that, right? They're just your, in some sense, eyes and ears into that study section, and they report back to you. They have no ability to influence the review, though. So you just need to know what they can and can't do.
Yes, but they can actually, they can help you strategize, say, with how to deal to a response to a reviewer. So when I get back the summary statement and there's a critique, I'll go ask the program officer, well, do you think I should approach it this way or that way? What's your take on that? And it almost becomes it's a scientific pros and cons conversation, and you kind of hash it out. And so you could use the program officer almost as a scientific sounding board, just to get another set of opinions. So.
One thing about program officers, the program officers before the review and after the review are different, have different value. The program officer is most valuable if they sat in on the review, because they can tell you, as I've been told, there was a real division in the study section. Some people thought this was a very good strategy, others didn't. You learn about that. You learn there's a lot of enthusiasm for this, just as you said. Someone said, it's actually they liked the idea, but they weren't happy with the grant. But before, in the beginning, I think program officers sometimes can mislead, because they don't really always know, what the science is and what the study section is, and they're not. That's not their job really. So also, it used to happen. Something called, I called program officer and I told them my idea, and they said that's great, but program officers like to encourage everybody to write grants. So they say to almost everybody, oh, that sounds great. So you can get some false encouragement that way, I think. So, and also there's a tremendous variation in skill set. I've met some really, really smart program officers, and then I've met some others. So just like on study sections, there's a tremendous range of skill in reviewing too. I've been on study section with some people I wish would not review grants for anyone. But but after, I think it was Sue pointing out, after the review, and if they've been in the review, they don't always go, but if they were there, that's a great piece of information.
Yeah, I agree with him. So if our application is triage it. I think a program officer doesn't have much information to give you. But if our application got scored, and summary statement include, I think, reviewers' critics, and one paragraph from the program officer. I always call to the program officer when I get the score, and sometimes he can tell me what they discussed from the other reviewer and give some of behind the kind of discussion story. It's very useful.
So in terms of the program officer, I guess my experience is they don't always say everything's great. Maybe it's just me that they don't always say it's great too, but that they, in fact, they want a portfolio of good science, and they are very excited about some ideas and less so about others. And when I was talking before about my preparations and sending a document to the program officers, I actually was talking about before I submit a grant, so that I will, and I agree with all these comments about what to do after you've had reviewers critique your grant, but I found value in developing that relationship with program officers to begin with. And sometimes we've had questions about, okay, here's our set of ideas, we're trying to manage it, and we've had program officers say, well, you know what, that's a bit unwieldy. How about you pull this piece off and put that in as an R21? You know, this, you kind of need to prove a little bit before you can go after it in an R01. So prove this in an R21 and then come back. So I think they can be valuable, the good ones at least, in a variety of ways.
There's another role that program officers play in the whole grant process that we haven't actually talked about, and that's supporting your grant to council, right? So there's after you get scored, right? Then the program officer presents those scores to the NIH council. In fact, the council's the one who gives you your, well, they're the one who stamp whether or not you've got the grant or not in some sense. So where a program officer can be particularly useful in some sense is making the case that a grant on the cusp, a 10, 11, or 12%, is to be put ahead of another 10, 11, or 12%, right? And so having a conversation with your program officer and getting them to maybe put at least a voice with the name, if not a face with the name, I think can work in your advantage. Unless you're a real jerk to the program officer, I don't see how it works to your disadvantage, right? But this program officer ranks the grants that based on the scores and sends it to council, and council then decides. You want your program officer to rank your 10% or 11% higher than another 10 or 11%, and I think it's when you're on the cusp is when it's particularly valuable.
So I just had that happen actually. So in a grant, I was probably 1 to 2% from the cutoff line, but the issue was that one of the reviewers was just, in fact, completely wrong about many of their comments, whereas the other two reviews were outstanding, and the other reviewer was just factually wrong. I mean, so bad that, for instance, I had 3 collaborators, and they thought that I would have difficulty because those collaborators are out of the country. Well, it turns out one of them's here, one of them was in Kansas, and one in California, and it was just like they were trying to find anything possible to really kill my grant. So I contacted the program officer, I brought up this issue, and what he said is, pull the things out that are incorrect and tell me why they're incorrect, so I can take it to council and say, if it weren't for this review, this would have been highly fundable. And I ended up getting the grant.
That's great.
So they pulled it inside the funding range because of that. But I mean, the review is very, very bad and very wrong.
That's interesting. Yeah, reviewers can get things wrong. Many times I've had reviewers say incorrect things, completely, really off base, misread the grant, don't know the science, and yet they say it. It's astonishing. So, and I've been at least involved in one successful appeal of review. I mean, it's not very common, but I have been involved in one years ago. We successfully appealed the review. It was full of major errors in fact, and we got a whole new review, and we got funded. The point about program officer study section is that they represent different interests. The program officer represents the institute. Study sections are academics like us. So the institute's investment is in the best grant, but it's also in field, in area, you know. And sometimes you get a program officer backing you because they want research in that area. They think it's deficient, it's not covered. Where a study section might be more interested in the technical details of what you did. So program officer can push the area for you as well. Or they can push for other reasons, such as you just gave a very nice example of. But yeah, they can advocate for you at council very much. And if they think you're doing good work on a good topic, that can be really valuable. I've also had the experience of being on the edge and being funded because of a sympathetic program office, sympathetic really to the field of research as much as to my specific project.
And that's one advantage of an RFA also. So I know I have two colleagues that submitted to an RFA and received scores in the 40th percentile and got funded. Because their particular area of research was what the program was looking for. So
there was a special pot set aside.
Yeah, there was a special pot of money set aside for this very type of research, and they just happened to be doing it and still got funded even though their scores were not that great. So oftentimes RFAs, if you fit nicely into them, they're good to go for. Oftentimes though, you have a very short period of time to write and submit that grant though. It's one disadvantage.
Anybody got a question? Okay, then another one on my list. What have you learned about winning grants by being a grant reviewer? How did that change your approach to grants? It must have been eye-opening for some of you.
Discussion is bad. Discussion kills a grant.
Elaborate. Tell us more.
If somebody within the group brings up an issue about your grant, saying, well, you know, I really don't think this is the best approach, oftentimes it just starts to pile on top of that. Mm-hmm. And then the next reviewer will go, well, yeah, you know, I really didn't like this either. And then your score just starts dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. What you really want is somebody to say, you know, this was an outstanding idea. I think this was really, really interesting. Their approach is pretty good. And if they start bringing up bad comments about it, it goes downhill from there.
So in the study sections you've been on, if it was a grant that got really good scores, the discussion tended to be very short?
Yes.
A couple of minutes, and that was it?
Well, a little bit longer than that. But
5, 10?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, the other advantage of putting in a good grant is they are reviewed in the order of good to bad. And you have to remember, you're sitting in this room for 2 days for like 9 hours. And if you're towards the end of that, everybody wants to get out of there and go home. Or they're oftentimes trying to make it to get to their plane so you can get out of town, and which is unfortunate. So, yeah, a lot of times if there's an issue with a grant, it'll take it down very fast.
Yeah, I have that comment. It's easy to review outstanding grant and bad grant. It's clear. But the difficult time, I think we spend more time in the pay line or marginal line. Some people they like, some people they don't like. So that's why we spend more time to discuss.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, so one of the things I find happens a lot in study section, it's actually really funny when it happens, is someone will, you go around the room, everybody says, the reviewer said what their initial score is, right? And then okay, so reviewer 1, can you tell us what you liked or didn't like? So, well, I gave this grant a 3, but they didn't do this, they didn't do this, they didn't do this. So a 3 is a pretty good score for a grant, right? And then they just sit there and they pile on criticism. And a good chair, And a funny chair will sometimes say, well, that doesn't sound like a 3 to me, right? That sounds more like a 5 or a 6, right? And so one thing to recognize, at least in the study sections that I've been a part of, and maybe we're not the meanest people, I've heard of mean study sections, right, is that scores tend to pile up in the 3 and 4s. I think a friend of mine from Johns Hopkins had a beautiful thing. I actually meant to get that data, but there's a curve of like 70% of the grants that are reviewed by study sections sort of hover around 3, 4, 5. NIH extended it from 1 to 9 to try to get rid of that phenomenon, but it's still right there, 3, 4, 5. And so like your raw score, you could get a 3 and everybody still hates it. But I find this in study section hundreds of levels. Someone will give it a 3 and then sit there and trash, simply because it's ungentlemanly, or in some sense, to give someone a 6 or a 7 when they really sort of deserve it.
Well, speaking of someone who actually has assigned a 9 in study section, there are two anecdotes I'll give. First of all, I was once, back when the lowest score was 5, I was once in a study section where reviewer 1, let's hear the scores. Reviewer 1, 1.1. Reviewer 2, 5. Actually, the same grant. The variability of people's responses is astonishing on study section. I thought this was wonderful. You thought that was wonderful? It was full of holes. And that tells you something. There's variability, there's chance, there's, people are going to react differently. Second thing I learned on study section that I told Tom the other day is once I was on study section, it was a grant on a rather minor topic. And really, you'd have to squeeze to think it was significant. But the first year said, it was such a pleasure to read such a nicely well-written grant. I really got what they wanted to do. Next review said, it was really pleasant, to read this grant. The grant got funded. In other words, everybody's busy. They don't want to spend time. This emphasizes how good it is to have a clear, simple, straightforward grant, streamlined. Sometimes it can overcome, it was well done on a relatively minor topic which had not been much investigated, perhaps because most people didn't think it was that important to investigate. But the point being that sometimes you can cut through that with just a very good, clear application. So writing clearly is terribly, terribly important.
I would say what I've learned from being on study section, quite simply, is I've learned what a good grant looks like, and I've learned what a bad grant looks like. And that is incredibly valuable information. In fact, I still remember, first time I was on study section, I read a grant on a topic in which they were actually recruiting subjects to participate, and I wanted to join. It was so good that I wanted to be one of those subjects. It was a very compelling story that this investigator wrote. So knowing what a good grant looks like, knowing what a bad grant looks like, is very valuable. I absolutely agree with Nigel on the importance of being clear. That is what I've learned, the importance of being clear. And also, it's been said on the panel already, the importance of writing to someone who is not an expert in your field, making sure it's clear to people, smart people, but not necessarily people that are highly familiar with specifically what you want to do. And my advice following up on that is to get experience reviewing grants, and there's lots of ways to do that. At the university level, there are grant opportunities, whether you call up foundations or and offer your services to review grants. Any opportunity that you have, or even just reviewing for colleagues, working together with other people and saying, I'll read yours if you read mine. You have an opportunity to read other people's grants, and you can see what works for them, and you can see the holes as well, and certainly help your colleagues fix their holes, but go home and fix your own holes as well, based on what you learn from reading other grants.
Yeah, with just 12 pages, space is at a premium, and you want enough white space, so schematics and diagrams, charts, things like that can help a lot. But for non-artistically inclined, it's easier to write a paragraph than to try to design something that's really professional in the way of a schematic. What are some practical tips that you all have in that regard?
So I don't think it has to be really artistically appealing in the grant. I really appreciate diagrams in the grant that actually diagram out what their hypothesis is and what each piece. I mean, I think that makes it so much more clear to the reviewer. I'm more visual than reading, so that's more helpful to me. So I always put a lot of diagrams in my grants. And they don't have to be from a biomedical artist level, but just easy words, even with arrows to this, to this, to this is, I think, really helpful.
Let me tell you one of the things I do, and I think Tom kind of liked this, is I actually, so recognizing that most of the people in your review panel will see your grant for the first time that day as they're talking about your grant, and likely will be sitting on your specific aims page. Right? So really understand that there's going to be 20 people who will be spending 2 minutes on your grant. Three people will have read your grant mostly. 20 people will look at it for 1 or 2 minutes, and then are going to give you a score. And it's not hard to do the math that 20 out of those 23 people really going to dictate what your score is going to be, right? So, understanding that those 20 people are looking at your specific aims page, I always put a figure on my specific aims page. I've got a figure that basically, you don't have to read this. You can pretty much see that I'm going to make a particle and it's going to go into a thing and there's going to be an image, right? So I kind of got a sense already without having to read that this grant is involved with doing this, doing this, doing this. And maybe while I'm listening to somebody, I'll read the first thing and I'll look at the aims, right? That's what your reviewers are doing. 20 out of 23 of your reviewers are doing that. So I recommend, and I do this for almost all my grants, putting a figure on your specific aims page, something small.
Yeah, I always put a figure on the specific aims page also. And one thing in a grant I just reviewed yesterday that I would recommend not doing is making that figure so small and the print so small that you can't read it, because that, I can tell you, it made me so mad to try to have to figure out what that was in all their figures. So make them large enough that you can see and read it. So it can backfire if you if you make them too small.
Yeah, especially consider reviewers are likely to be older than you, and their visual acuity likely to be less. And if you're having trouble with those small, think of me. So the font, there's a fixed font size for the text, but they allow you to make it smaller on the figure. Try not to take advantage of that too much. Try to keep it the same size. I also think I agree with the idea of an aims. What it should do is it's the overarching synthesis of all your aims in one figure. If you can get that with the causal pathway set out, I think that's what you're aiming for. And I'd spend time thinking about how to make that very, very clear. And with large enough type, and not so much in there that looks like spaghetti thrown against a wall, but really looks like something you could grasp and understand, that gives you an overview. If you can manage to do that, that's a wonderful thing. Some grants are more, some less susceptible to that kind of treatment, but if you can do it, I fully agree with both my colleagues here.
So I've never put a figure in the specific aims, but I took some advice actually from Tom a couple of years back or last year where instead of having a figure, have like a single declarative statement that basically at the bottom of the page, separated out, that basically defines what you're going to do. Mm-hmm. So they can just read that one overall impact statement, and in theory, that should tell the story of the grant. So it's not a picture, but it's almost like a mission statement for the project. And I found that a very helpful tip, and I now include that basically on all specific aims pages. Yeah.
It relates to the question and the length of the text and the way to get your message across most efficiently. One of the things that we've taken to doing along with figures is actually using the text box. And I use text boxes quite a bit. One thing I use text boxes for is definitions. And I started this after one of the grants I wrote, and this was back in the days of the 25 pages, on asthma. So that was the topic of study, and one of the reviewers asked, well, what do you mean by asthma? I thought, oh my gosh, 25 pages. And they didn't quite get it. So, how is it diagnosed? What are this inclusion criteria? And we'll use a box for these key points.
Good points.
Define asthma, we define allergy, we define this, and that. And it's set off. It was in the text of those 25 pages, but it was in there somewhere. But with a box, and I'll often title it definitions or key points or key this or that. And then each word is in bold, and you have a lot of information that's very hard to miss in the boxes.
I want to go back to the question of what did you learn at serving on study sections. What I learned, I think, is it was generous of the government to hold a floating seminar for 4 years that allowed me to look at everybody that was working in my field, essentially, and where they were about their critical thinking and which techniques or procedures they thought worked and which ones didn't work. And those were the grants, but they were also the reviewers' comments on the grants. The reviewer said, oh, that technique will never have the right sensitivity to do A, B, or C. There's just a huge amount of information that's frequently communicated informally among investigators that if you serve on a study section, you see. And you also then have a real appreciation of exactly where the field is moving. The other thing I've seen, of course, is I had a Nobel Prize winner's proposal that I turned down. It was trivial, okay? He didn't write anything. And it came back next time, and I reviewed it the second time, and it was beautifully written. So I learned how to write grants.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are coming to our last 20 minutes of this, and I've got an advertisement from the Office of the Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies to fit in here, and I'm going to close a little early so you can come up and meet our panelists if you have an individual question. So we're coming down to the time where if your question isn't asked, it's not going to be asked. So does somebody have something?
To come back to the question about figures, do you prefer big montage figures, lots of panels, or smaller figures broken up next to the relevant text?
Absolutely next to the relevant text. I don't like reading a grant and then having to go a page or two to try to find that figure. It's nice to have it right there. So making smaller figures that are right next to the relevant text, I would highly recommend that.
I think the question of figures gets down to the point of making it easy for your reviewers to get the information that they can then put into their reviews, right? I mean, figures are figures, right? But it's really about clearly communicating that information. One of the things also to understand about what a reviewer is doing is he or she is sitting there with a piece of paper that they have to fill in. Innovation, strengths, weaknesses, approach, strengths, weaknesses. One of the things that I do, right, is, and I'm probably not alone in doing this, is I will put directly, the innovation of this grant is this, ... The significance of this grant is if we're successful, ... I almost make it such, I did a work for the reviewer for them. All they have to do is cut and paste. The innovation is this, the innovation is this. We talked a little bit about, there's these new NIH guidelines for robustness and reproducibility, and nobody knows what to do with them, right? So I've simply put in the grant, the robustness of this grant is ... The reproducibility, is demonstrated by ... right? So again, it is figures, right? But really what I think everybody's dancing around a bit right now is clearly communicating this really complicated concept to someone who's never seen it before. You can do it with figures, you can do it with text boxes. That's such a cool idea. Or you can do it with clearly demarcated dots and make it really easy for your reviewer to in some sense, cut and paste. Oh, the innovation is this. That's right there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you very much. And I have a question about the program officer. And my current understanding is we'd better have a very good network relationship with him or she. But what's the definition of a good job of program officer? Like, how easy? What did they do? They can be promoted, and what we can do to have them promoted. I think then we may have a good relationship.
Go ahead.
I think, like was mentioned earlier, how your program officer will help you out really varies between program officer. You have some that will read your specific aims and give you back suggestions or recommendations. They'll also sit in when your grant is being reviewed and take very nice notes and let you know what was discussed and what you might do to improve it. But then there are or program officers that really don't do any of that. So it really varies.
Okay, last question from the audience, and then we're going to have some advertising from the Vice President's office.
Hope this is worthy of a last question. Maybe you ought to give the option for another one. But with regards to appendices, that's always been a big gray area. You know, I know sometimes reviewers don't bother. It's all they can do to just read. The aims and the approach, and maybe other very relevant. And others will say, well, you know, you can circumvent page limits. You put it in the resources. You put it in the equipment. You put it here. You put it there. You put it into biosketches now. So what's the balance, and particularly as it applies to appendices?
Yeah, I've been bitten by that. I tried to sneak stuff in. I put a whole bunch of, I once submitted a grant, and you can do 3 appendices at the time, maybe you still can, and I put 3 abstracts from conferences that had like a ton of information. And in the grant I said, you know, as you can see in Appendix 1, we've been able to do this, this, and that, right? And my grant comes back slammed that I circumvented page limits. So, you know, I was pretty naive at the time, and, you know, I learned my lesson from that, that's for sure. You know, there's things you can, so like I love using the veterinary animals section to describe pages and pages and pages of rationalization for animals. I describe in detail the surgical procedures. We go through the power analysis there. I mean, these are all things that really do belong in vertebrate animal section. You know, in my grant, I'll say, you know, in general, we'll put lines and we'll do a surgery, the details of which are in the vertebrate animal section. That seems to go over really well, and, you know, that saves you, you know, a paragraph or 2 even.
Yeah. It's difficult to get the reviewers to look much beyond the core grant. I think of the things that they will look at next, biosketches is number 1. I always look at biosketches. I want to know who these people are, what they've done, what they've published, what they're any good. And those paragraphs that describe what they're doing are very important. You can pack a lot of prior work in there, you know, because people will read that. And it would help you you don't have to say quite so much in the grant about the investigators themselves. As far as appendices, I only use them to kind of demonstrate that there is a thing there. Like to say, all right, we've developed this really innovative questionnaire in which we can ask this and we can ask that, and we get questions, and you put the questionnaire in the appendix. It's just that it is there, it does exist. Anything more than that is probably risky, like as you gave an example. You know, it's just to show that if anybody doubted, well, they talk about having a questionnaire, but have they really designed a questionnaire? Well, it's in the appendix, you know, that kind of thing that nobody wants to read in full, but you give evidence of its existence, and that's just about it.
Yeah, I've actually, to follow that, I've seen a really good example. Someone was making a web-based tool, and you're not allowed to, I guess you can put in, you know, and that website is da-da-da-da-da, and a reviewer doesn't have to go to that website, right? Because there's these urban legends that people would set that up, and then they'd track IP addresses, and then they know, my reviewer is Dr. Jackson from UT Southwestern, because why in the world, right? So what I've saw somebody do in their appendix is just literally, you know, PDF out what that website looks like. You know, and I thought that was a really good use of the appendix, and you know, people on the panel liked it as well. Yeah.
I want to mention also the supporting letter is very important to fill out if you don't have expertise in the specific approach or something like that in the proposal. And the second thing is if you have the publication record, your preliminary data is accepted before the review, it will nearly help your proposal.
Okay. Lauren, you and Jeff, come on forward. While they're making the ad, you guys think of one last word you might like to say before we close. So my friends and colleagues, Lauren Ernie Fleschner and Jeff Croft, are going to tell you about the services, the grant services of the Office of the Vice President. If you like this panelist today, this meeting, this is the idea of Corey Washington, the Director of Analytical Services. He thought this might be something that you would like. The Vice President's office really does understand that it's harder for people to win grants today than it used to be by a lot, and they are trying to help. So they have some grant services that you may not know about. So my friends and colleagues here, Lauren and Jeff, are going to tell you about them while the panelists think of their final last word. Please.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I work in the Office of the Vice President of Research and Graduate Studies in research facilitation and dissemination, and we have several proposal preparation services that I'd like to tell you about right now. We assist faculty members with finding funding opportunities, federal, state, and foundation funding opportunities that would be useful for their projects. So if you would like help with that assistance, please contact us. We also provide a lot of grant writing assistance. We will get involved with proposal editing and formatting. We will be involved in budget preparation. We'll provide templates for supplementary materials for your grants, such as letters of support and data management plans. And in addition to those services, we also provide monthly workshops throughout the academic year. The next workshop that's coming up is next Thursday at 3 o'clock. It's called NIH Recommendations for Rigor and Reproducibility, Use of Animals in Research, and that's on the flyer that's outside on the desk that you received when you walked in. So it would be great to see some of you there. And finally, our office does provide travel support for those of you who wish to travel to a funding agency to meet in person with program officers. This support is generally matched by your college or department, but funds are available for that through our office.
Good morning. My name is Jeff, and my role at VPRGS is assisting researchers in connecting with editors and peer reviewers. As Eric referenced, and Rob as well, we help connect with proven editors, typically in field, but also just with experience with NIH or NSF, and then also help you connect with peer reviewers externally and defray some of the costs of the honorarium as well. Let me go ahead and grab the advance. Here we go. In addition to that, we have Tom available for proposal consulting. We have first draft review, the grant editing, the funding. We also help you navigate SciVal if you're not familiar with that, as well as the seminars and webinars we mentioned there. We do have the sheet for the upcoming webinars. We both an NSF track and an NIH track that are out there. I encourage you to sign up for those, as Tom mentioned earlier. And then Tom also hosts the grant hot seat sessions. So,
yes, I do. So I'll tell you about that later. Come to the mixer this afternoon, and we'll talk about your grant desires. Anything you want to ask, we'll talk about it over drinks. So, Lauren, Jeff, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, any last words before we close? And I'm going to invite people to come up and meet you. So, go ahead.
Did you want the three?
Whatever you'd like to say. The 3 top things you've learned, or any one thing you've learned. Whatever you'd like to say.
Well, I did think of 3 things because you suggested we do so. And the 3 things that I have learned about NIH grant funding is, first of all, that writing grants has been good for my science. It helps me organize, it helps me self-critique, it provides me with a plan when I'm done. So actually, when we moan and groan a little bit, writing grants has actually been good for my science. The second thing I've learned is that weaknesses in either my plan or my presentation are very readily apparent to others. If I am a little concerned about it, someone else is going to see it. And then the third thing is what I've said before, is that study section service is really very valuable for learning how to write a good grant.
Brian.
I guess mine would be keep your grant very simple so that it's easy to read and easy to follow, and you can read it quickly and get it right away. Like I said earlier, it's nice to have the reviewers on the committee know you on the study section. And what else? Yeah, if you are asked to sit on a study section, absolutely do it. I mean, that's a good experience.
I would say only do science you really want to do. Be sure, at the beginning is the idea. The core thing is that spend a lot of time thinking about the idea. Don't rush into the technological measurement right away. First think about the idea. And the other thing is every scientist is trained to be a journalist. We write for medical journals. And don't forget that. We're writers. If you can't write your idea, you can't present it in a journal, you can't present it in a grant. So you have to think a lot about wording and writing, and there's no way around that. A great scientist who can't write is very handicapped. And so keep that in mind. Work on those skills.
I think the advice that I would give is the same idea looked at 2 different ways. A bad idea will never get funded. A bad idea is not going to get funded. A good idea might get funded, right? It's all roulette in some sense, right? It's who your reviewer one is. It's whether you are discussed first or whether you were discussed 5th or 10th. There's a significant aspect of chance and roulette into this whole thing. So for every story we hear of someone who got a 50th percentile who got funded on the next round, there's a story of someone who got a 12th percentile on the cusp and then the next submission got triaged. Right? So, you always hear about the really good success stories. You don't hear so much about the terrible stories. Submit good ideas, write good grants, expect to get some of them sometimes, and that's the reality of this, of the situation. Accept the fate of chance.
Okay. I guess what I learned as an assistant professor going through all this was that I think earlier on writing things like F-32s or career development grants, it was when those grants were being reviewed, it was kind of like maybe there was kid gloves on with the reviewers, and so. And when I got to finally the R01 level, those kid gloves were off. And making that transition to that R01 level required, for me, a lot of help. And so just sort of get as much assistance as you can from senior people who really know what's required to take that next sort of leap. For me, that was really important, getting lots of eyes on things to take that next level.
Okay, I think the important thing is the significance and innovation. And one more thing is don't forget to keep generating data and publication. Without preliminary data, it's impossible to get fund.
Oh yeah, one more thing, because this is assistant professors, right? Understand really clearly about early stage investigator and new investigator status for NIH, right? R01s give you that, R21s don't give you that, and you don't get it forever. So, use it to your advantage while you can.
And also, like you said, you're not going to get every grant funded, and you're going to get a review back that's going to make you horrendously mad. The best thing to do is to read that review, put it away for 2 weeks, and then pull it back out, and oftentimes it'll be like, aha, oh, now I know what they mean. I know what they want now. It's not that bad, you know. So it's good to put it away and let it settle for a while.
Okay, and so with this, we're going to close, and I'd like to thank our panel. Please give them a big hand. They came out here to share their advice.